Yeah, no,
Yes. We have 200 people ready.
there will be too many people. We have 150 chairs, so it's we're funded by
Maybe one day.
Later, we're going to in the front. Yeah. Okay, I'll leave it here.
Yeah, for now. All right. Yes, I am going to do my
Okay. Okay. I think so, yeah. Good. Great. Good morning, everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde. Bienvenue tout le monde. Good morning. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à l'Université d'Ottawa. Pour ceux et celles qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Monica Gattinger. Je suis directrice de l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique et la présidente de l'initiative Énergie positive. For those who don't know me, my name is Monica Gattinger. I'm the director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy and the chair of Positive Energy. Thank you all for coming this morning. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. We're very delighted to have you with us here this morning as we officially launch the next 3 years of the Positive Energy Initiative. For those who don't know Positive Energy, well, you're about to learn quite a bit about Positive Energy. We began in 2015, and the mandate of the initiative is to strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making, whether that's at the policy level, the regulatory level, or the individual energy project decision-making level. Positive Energy was supposed to be a 3-year project, and at the end of 3 years in 2018, when we had our final conference last spring, many of our funders and others in the Positive Energy Network very strongly encouraged us to continue. So we are continuing, and we are now launching the next 3 years of Positive Energy, which are going forward under the title of Canada's Energy Future in an Age of Climate Change. We're turning our attention to the long term of Canada's energy future and how we can build and maintain public confidence in decision-making arrangements for the country's energy future. The work that we're doing would not be possible without generous funding from a variety of different funding sources coming from the business sector, the policy sector, the regulatory sector, and I'd like to just list the funders for you. Alberta Energy, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission, the British Columbia Utilities Commission, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Wind Energy Association, Cenovus, Encana, Natural Resources Canada, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So as you'll see, we've got a pretty wide diversity of funders. We're actually in discussions with a number of other organizations who are keen to come on board as funders of the initiative, so we look forward to announcing additional funders in the coming months. This morning's event is webcast. We had tremendous demand for this event, which is launching publicly this report, which of course is entitled Canada's Energy Future in an Age of Climate Change, but it's the subtitle that I'd like to draw your attention to, which is how partisanship, polarization, and parochialism are eroding public confidence. If you'd asked me, I should say, the Positive Energy Research Team, about a year ago, what our research and engagement priorities would be for Positive Energy for the next 3 years, I don't know that we would have listed polarization and partisanship among those priorities. But the last year has seen tremendous change in the Canadian energy landscape, in the Canadian environmental and climate change landscape, and in the political landscape. And so we have come to see that we need to be focusing in on some really key priority areas. Polarization is one of them. We'll be talking much more about that this morning. So I invite you to have a read of this report. It's hot off the presses. For those who are watching the webcast, it is available on our website. We'll be presenting it here this morning. This is an opportunity for us to share with you where we see some of the core issues for Canada when it comes to charting its energy future in an age of climate change. And we're looking forward to your comments and feedback, because for us, this helps to lay out our research and engagement agenda for the next 3 years. So, without further ado, you have the agenda for this morning. I wanted to just give you a quick run through of that agenda, and then we'll get started for today. This morning we'll begin with the presentation of the report. Myself and co-author Mike Cleland are going to give you a brief presentation on the report. We'll move into some question and answer at that point. Following a break, we're going to come back, and we're very fortunate to have an extremely strong response panel of leaders from the energy and climate sectors to give us some hopefully very constructive critique on the report and to share some of their perspectives on the issues that it raises. One of the things that we've done at Positive Energy for this next 3 years that I'm really, really excited about is to integrate in an inclusive fashion the arts in our work. So we're extremely lucky to have with us this morning a visual artist by the name of Cameron Cross, who is here up at the front. Cameron, if you want to give a wave. And Cameron is our arts consultant. He's actually he's a member of our research team, a full-fledged member of the team, and he works with us to try to think through how can we integrate the arts in different creative ways of thinking about some of the issues that we're grappling with in the work that we do, not only to help us, but also hopefully to help all of us who are grappling with these issues to think about them in different ways and hopefully productive ways. So Cameron today is going to be mind mapping, a term that I learned from Cameron, is going to be mind mapping our session this morning. And I'm going to turn the floor over at this point to Cameron to share with us what mind mapping is all about, what he's going to be doing for us here today. Cameron.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? Good. Thanks for having me here. It's good to be in Ottawa. Not that there's anything wrong with Winnipeg. It's nice to break away once in a while. Thank you, Monica, for inviting me here and allowing me to be a part of the team. It's very important to incorporate creativity, especially in the arts, into many things that we do. It's a good 21st century skill. I'm going to talk a little bit about mind mapping and show you a presentation. First of all, just a show of hands, has anyone heard of mind mapping? Has anyone done mind mapping? Hey, not bad. Okay. So this is the father or the grandfather of the modern day mind map. His name is Tony Buzan. And he's a British psychology author, brain researcher. He actually went to UBC. He's probably in his mid-70s now. And he's an expert on mental literacy and memory and creativity. He's written over 100 books, translated into 150 languages. And according to his website, there are about 250 million people that have mind mapped because of him and his books and his videos and his lectures. I spent my career in education. I was an education consultant for the province of Manitoba. Probably about 10 years ago, everybody jumped on this mind mapping bandwagon, and it really resonated with a lot of people. Some people stayed with it, some people let it go, but that's just the way things are these days, I guess. This is the basic architecture of a mind map. There's a main bubble, or the main idea, in the middle. There are secondary ideas that come out in the form of thicker branches, and then tertiary ideas in the form of thinner branches. So it's very, 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 very simple. So it's meant to sort of mimic how what we know about the brain, actually. I did a search on the internet. This was probably the best example I could show you of a mind map. So perhaps this person went to a health conference and did the mind map on health. So in the very center, there's an image of an apple, that person's visual interpretation of health. And then the big branches coming out, maybe the 4 key areas from the presentation or the lecture: stress, sleep, diet, and exercise. Then if you follow up, so you see stress coming into the smaller tertiary ideas, causes of stress, exams, work, relationships, maybe climate change, sleep, comfy mattress, regular hours, and you'll notice that everything is accompanied by an image. So it doesn't matter if you're a good drawer, it just matters if you depict something in a visual way. And exercise, aerobic, treadmill, diet, veggie, fruit, wide variety, vitamins. So it's another way to create notes. So the way I interpret it, I would say that there are 6 basic principles. Number 1, there's a central idea or an image, and an image. So the idea is always accompanied by an image. Number 2, larger branches connect to smaller branches, right? So from the central idea, you have a larger branch with the secondary idea, and then the third idea or the tertiary idea after that. Branches are curvilinear, not straight lines. So if you listen to Tony speak, there are no straight lines in nature, and there are no straight lines in the brain, right? So he thinks that the brain will pick up on an organic shape better than a straight line. Number 4, 1 word per branch, and that fosters connections and associations. So, for example, if you had a branch and you wrote a sentence, that might be a little bit more linear, so the brain might not make connections as readily. Number 5, different colors, brain picks up on colors. And number 6, images throughout, right? So a picture is worth 1,000 words. So if you look at a picture, your brain will think of many different things. This I found in Scientific America, a recent edition. Scientists create largest map of the brain connections to date. So that's kind of what our brain looks like when it's doing its thing. So you can see where he's coming from here. No straight lines. So the purpose of a mind map, number 1, it's an alternative to taking notes, right? So, and it's, as you get older, it might be harder to make that transition, but once you do, it's not, do I do it all the time? No. Have I done it? Yes. And sometimes it's good to, even map out your day. Number 2, the mind map will help recall a meeting, a conference, or a lecture. So if somebody did a mind map of this morning, which I did, and which hopefully maybe you will, in 6 months' time, you'll look back at the map and things will naturally occur in the brain that you'll remember. It's kind of like if you try to remember your best friend's birthday from 12 years ago, and someone gave you some text, or somebody gave you one photo to look at. If you look at that photo, chances are a lot of memories will happen. Number 3, use mind maps to, you can map your event, routines, your calendar. A lot of people do. Does anyone do that? Marissa, you said maybe sometimes you do that yesterday, yeah. And neuroplasticity, that's a pretty interesting topic. So like as we get older, there are little tricks that we can do to help our brain grow and be more functioning. Big things like learning a new language, learning how to play a musical instrument. I did some reading the other day on some research about even little things about like brushing your teeth with your opposite hand, standing on one foot. It's like a little trick. Your brain has to learn a minute, different method of doing something. And what else? Lots of software on mind mapping. So FreeMind, XMind, Mind Manager. I have not used these, but looks something like this. So add an image, add your notes. Good for teleconferences, video conferences. So instead of, if there was a teleconference or a video conference, instead of sending out minutes, maybe the moderator sends out a map. So that's something that people might want to try. There's another example. And you too can mind map. So on your notes sheet in your booklet, you have to do this? No, but maybe you might want to forego your normal method of taking notes and maybe try mind map today and just get out your note sheet and scribble away to see if it resonates. And that's it. So, one thing, sorry. So on the easel, I spent about a week doing a mind map of the report. So once Mike and Monica finish speaking, I'll unveil that. And then when the panel is talking, I'll do my best to sort of live mind map. And we're going to ask something of you afterwards, and that Raphael will help me explain that, but we're going to get you to tweet one word on how you sort of view this topic today. But we'll explain that a bit later. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. It's like you were in my bathroom because I actually do that. Interesting example you came up with. There I am in my washroom brushing the teeth on one foot. So this, as Cameron said, this for us is the beginnings of thinking about how we can use the arts to help us to stimulate our creativity, note taking, and the like. And Cameron is also working, we won't be talking about it this morning, but probably will down the line at some of our other events. Cameron is working on a very impressive, large public art project for the National Capital Region that relates to energy and transitioning to lower emissions energy systems and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So we're very excited to be helping him and supporting him in that. So this is a moment where we get into presentation of the report. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with Mike Cleland on this, my co-conspirator in authoring this document. Tremendously productive writing relationship that we have. Sometimes interesting writing relationship that we have. Always fun, and I always learn a tremendous amount. So please join me in welcoming Mike to the stage.
Interesting. That usually suggests something that you go on to expound on that.
After you
Anyway,
present. Get to that out of the way. There.
well, thank you, Monica, and thanks to everyone who took the time to join us this morning for this conversation. We very much appreciate the potential that's out there with the kind of people we have in the room. So, with that in mind, and also thanks to our panelists for agreeing to take the time, we want to make as much time as possible for the general exchange, which is a long-winded way of saying I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible, and if I don't, Monica will make it interesting for me. Let me start with. First of all, figuring out how this works. A quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to take a couple of minutes at the outset by way of introduction, framing the challenge. A little bit more time going on from there, talking about Canadian energy and climate policy in a domestic and global perspective, really with a focus on the past and the present. I'm going to hand it off to Monica after that, who will take a forward look centered on this idea of Canada's energy future in an age of climate change. And then a conclusion, which we hope will be positive in the sense of going from partisanship, polarization, and parochialism to public confidence. And we'll see how far we get on that over the next 3 years, but that is our objective and one that we hope to carry out working with people such as yourselves. Very briefly, framing the challenge, and I'm going to go through each of these themes, or I'm going to touch on them very quickly, that we've got ourselves in a very deep hole on this file right now, and we are stuck. And the question is, how do we get out of it? As we try to get out of it, we are dealing with a lot of sources of uncertainty. We can talk about that, but if anything, indications are that that's growing, and that we've concluded in the Positive Energy team that there are 3 critical work tracks for decision makers, which also, as it turns out, are the work tracks for our research over the next 3 years, some of which has already begun. So, again, being potentially in the worst, and maybe in fact in the worst of both worlds, we are, no news here, falling short on our climate commitments. Again, probably not news, but maybe new, that we are undercutting Canada's most important export sector. I don't think we've got as far as putting, on the domestic front, putting the energy fundamentals at risk, although we've seen some evidence of that with respect to affordability in the electricity sector in Ontario, and we know that there are risks elsewhere throughout the domestic energy economy. One thing we know for sure is that we are generating a high-risk investor environment, and that may be across the board with respect to the Canadian economy. It's certainly true in the energy system, and all indications are that that, in fact, is growing. The erosion of public confidence, again, that's not new, but there are a lot of things going on that are, if anything, contributing to that. And of course, as Monica noted in her introduction, an increasingly polarized debate on energy and climate. What I like to think of is that on either side of the center of the debate, we seem to have the shouting classes who are occupying most of the airtime, and part of our objective, and I like to think the objective of a lot of other people in this room, is for some of that airtime to get taken over by some different folks. Multiple sources of uncertainty. One could spend a lot of time on this slide, and one won't, because in fact Monica is going to build on these themes in her part of the presentation. But maybe some sort of cross-cutting notions to think about is as we look at these, this is our judgment as to what are the principal sources of uncertainty. How many of these are long-standing? How many of them are new? Most of them, in fact, are probably long-standing. How many of them are specific to energy versus more widespread in their implications? And arguably, very little of this is unique to energy. Some of it bears more heavily on energy, but all of it is across the economy. And finally, which of these are growing? Where do we see rapid change in this sort of context? So again, Monica is going to come back to this. And again, critical work tracks for decision makers. This really is the core of what positive energy is going to be about for the next 3 years, is building a body of research and engagement that we think can contribute constructively to what the decision makers are going to actually have to do. So let me talk about some of the substance that underlies this. What we've ended up doing in the course of trying to pull this work together is identified what we see here as 6 critical themes that will bear on the debate and the discussion over the course of the next few years. And I'm going to walk through each of these, and maybe start by emphasizing that we don't necessarily claim to any unique degree of wisdom with respect to this. There is a lot of expertise on energy and climate that's out there and in this audience. What we're suggesting, though, is that these are the principal themes that we should be thinking about. And again, hopeful that the critique we get from our panel and from others will bring more wisdom to the table. So let's start with lots of climate talk, but limited effective action. And for those of you who've been working this file for a while, this will be familiar territory. It is drearily familiar, is how I would characterize it. If you look going back to Rio, and then Kyoto, and then Copenhagen, and then Paris, going to international meetings where everybody with good intentions, no doubt, committed to restraining the growth of greenhouse gas emissions, driving them down, and then we all came home and reality took over again, time after time after time. Now, whether that will prove to be true about Paris remains to be seen. We'll have to see how the numbers unfold. But I would be very, very surprised if we saw a very significant break from this pattern, unless we start to take the issue a bit more seriously. So why? Well, one good source of information to help us understand this is the International Energy Agency, and whose World Energy Outlook 2018 is instructive. And we've drawn two scenarios or snapshots of two scenarios from the World Energy Outlook. The first one, what they call the new policy scenario, essentially policies that have been put in place or at the very least announced by governments around the world. And where does it lead you? Some interesting things to look at. A growth in renewables for sure, rapid growth in renewables for sure, but from a very small base. So still occupying a relatively small part of the primary energy demand. Continuing presence of oil and refined petroleum products, whether we like it or not, going out to 2040, and in fact a very substantial presence. Again, based on policies in place or announced. Growth in natural gas demand for a number of reasons. And then perhaps surprising, still a great deal of coal in the primary energy mix. So let's get a little bit more aggressive, and this is what's called the Sustainable Development Scenario, which is intended to align with the Paris targets looking out to 2050. So coal declines. That's the bottom one again. Unlike the previous scenario, renewables or renewables more generally take a much larger role. There is a downtick in the presence of oil and refined petroleum products in this world, largely reflective of the electrification of the transportation sector. Natural gas continues to play a very significant role in the picture. So bringing this back home to what we call Canadian energy realities, and again, this is the kind of thing we could spend the whole day just talking about this one slide and probably disagreeing on all sorts of it, but some things to reflect on. Oil and gas is still the single largest export earner for Canada. The automobiles sector is close behind, and it varies depending on the state of prices, but still a hugely important part of the whole Canadian economy. International markets are going to determine a lot of the outcomes, and we see that looking back on the IEA slides. International markets are going to determine what happens to the supply and the demand with respect to oil and gas in particular. Other governments are going to have the biggest part of the game in terms of shaping policy, in terms of shaping where it goes. The United States, China, India, a lot of other large population countries are going to be the ones that shape the international reality as we look forward. And on the technology front, Canada will be a constructive contributor to the evolution of the technology that supports all of this. But by and large, we are going to be a technology taker. And at the end, consistent with the international picture, most of our energy consumption, and now I'm looking out to 2040, 2050, that vicinity, most of our energy consumption will still be based on oil and gas. And to the extent that we want to move away from that or move into a cleaner energy picture, we're looking at a very, very big infrastructure build in order to achieve that. All indications are that renewables will continue to decline in cost, but also that they will still be a relatively small part of supply, since most of the renewables are focused on the electricity sector, and electricity is still a relatively small part of energy end use. Public support at the high level polling, what you get is strong indications that the public want governments to act on greenhouse gas reductions. But put to it, when you get to individual consumers or individual communities, and it starts to involve things like energy costs or other impacts on the communities, that support looks very theoretical indeed. And we've seen that time and time again, and that is certainly we've seen that in the positive energy research. Part of the reason for that being that clean is all very nice, but all sources of energy have environmental and social costs. So I would love to spend the next part of the whole morning on this slide, but I promise I won't. This is from a credible analysis, the Trache Energy Futures project, looking at what it might mean for Canada, at least in one scenario, in which we achieve the Paris target, looking out to 2050. Think of three things here. Electricity infrastructure, more than doubling. Maybe taking a very different form than we've seen traditionally, as we see distributed energy options and solar and storage, but still in all, more than doubling in 30 years, what has taken us about 100 years to build, and doing it in a context where the public no longer just rolls over and takes it. Oil and gas production. 50% down, exports 50% down from 2013 levels. And just to ask yourself whether you can think of any other Canadian export industries that may have been coming under pressure lately and where that generated political controversy. Think about that. Across the Canadian economy. And the electrification of the transportation fleet. All sorts of things that may get in the way of that. But one of the things that we haven't been talking about is what does the Canadian transportation sector, our automobile industry, look like in this world? Do we have a big part of this world, or do we slowly fade away? We need to be thinking about that kind of thing. So we talk about the perils of vocabulary. And I just want to, there are all sorts of parts of vocabulary in this discourse that we think have gotten in the way of things, but just think about this, the term NIMBY, that's an oldie, goes back several decades, and it has always been used pejoratively, and one of its effects has been to cut off debate, where sometimes there were some very legitimate reasons for that debate. On the other hand, turning it on its head, we've taken things like social license and consent and bandied those about in ways that have created expectations that governments can't meet. We talk about low carbon or low emissions, but we need to ask ourselves, to what extent does our vocabulary lead us to notions of fuel and technology determinism in a world where we know that the technology is changing very, very rapidly indeed, and what it's actually going to look like 20 or 30 years from now, we just don't know. I mentioned clean energy, a very subjective notion. For some people, it means low carbon. If it's somebody in a local community, it could mean low air emissions. It could mean a minimal other environmental impacts. But it gets bandied about as if we're actually agreeing on something. And finally, speaking as if we're actually agreeing on something, the notion of transition, really, if you stop to think about it, empty rhetoric. Transition appears to imply something inevitable. It's not. It's going to require a great deal of will, and it's, if you look at it closely, transformation may be a more accurate word. So bringing it to a close, again, we're all familiar with this, but Canada's distinctive character makes the whole thing tougher for Canada than it is for a lot of other countries. We can talk for a long time about the energy intensity of the Canadian economy and why it's as energy intensive as it is, but it is. And part of the reason for that is because we have a big resource economy. We are resource rich, not only in energy resources, but in others. That's a good thing. but it has implications for where we go in terms of the evolution of energy and the dealing with climate change. And part of the consequence of that is distinct regional endowments, and we're seeing today some of the implications of that as we see reactions in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan to what's been happening to the industry. A decentralized federation where we've seen this week not only do the provinces have the majority of the jurisdiction with respect to energy, but the government of British Columbia seems to think that one of Canada's most long-standing federal powers with respect to works and undertakings beyond the boundaries of a province should actually be trumped, as it were, by a provincial power, essentially property and civil rights within the province. So who knows where the courts are going to go, but it could become even more decentralized and tougher still for a national policy to come about. And finally, or not quite finally, strong democratic traditions, good, but with growing expectations on the part of the populace as to what that might mean in terms of decision making. And finally, a highly open economy, again, something that's been good for Canada for many, many years, but that in many ways makes these challenges even tougher. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Monica to pick it up and take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So, looking forward then, so Mike sort of took you where we've been. I'm going to be spending the remainder of the presentation looking forward. And as I mentioned at the outset, this next 3 years of Positive Energy is forward-looking, exploring Canada's energy future in an age of climate change. And one of the things that we've brought forward in this report, and I would highly encourage you to read it, there are copies there, makes for some great reading, we hope. But one of the things that we tried to bring forward in this report is this notion of parochialism, and that many of our debates around energy, environment, and climate in Canada have tended to be, whether it's sort of domestically focused or regionally focused, but they've also tended to be relatively sort of inward looking, not necessarily looking at some of the larger drivers that are affecting decision making across all sectors, energy and climate being one of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll focus in on where the work tracks are that we see for decision makers and that Positive Energy has prioritized for our research and engagement over the next 3 years. So what are these drivers? I'm going to be talking about each of these briefly. Polarization and partisanship, the decline of trust and deference, what we seem to see as the emergence of a new global economic order, emerging and disruptive technologies, and then the increasingly visible and tangible effects of climate change itself. And whether you're working in the energy space or working in virtually any other public policy sector, these drivers are having tremendous impact upon decision-making systems. And so when it comes to thinking about public confidence and decision-making in the energy sector, that's where we're really focusing our work. But there are many other sectors that are facing similar challenges as a result of these drivers. So I'm going to just bring you through each of these briefly. Obviously, the report, you can dive into that for a more fulsome treatment. So driver number one, polarization, partisanship, and there's this term here, motivated reasoning, and that's the term I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. So we've got, Mike mentioned Trump a moment ago, but we see increasing polarization and partisanship across Western industrialized democracies. I've pointed to one democracy in particular here in the slide, but it's not the only one. And for those who can't read because of the distance, the comedy here, it says, a study linking autism to childhood vaccinations has not only been debunked, but it is an elaborate fraud. We trust this ends the matter. Then a woman wearing a T-shirt that says anti-vaccine activist on it has her fingers in her ears saying la 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 la. And this is a really interesting illustration of what literature in cognitive psychology and political science refers to as motivated reasoning, which is that we perceive risks not necessarily based upon sort of a solid, rational assessment of the evidence, but based upon our values, based upon our worldviews, and in some instances also based upon our group identity. And this is very troubling, particularly in the energy sector, which is the focus of our work, to the extent that key issues in the energy sector, call it a carbon tax, call it market access, call it transition, give it whatever concept that you want, once those become closely related to group identity and notably partisan political identity, it can be very difficult to undertake evidence-informed decision-making, because the assessment of those issues is coming through our group identity and values and worldviews potentially more than it is coming from a rigorous assessment of the evidence. And I see people in the room getting uncomfortable about this. Good. It's a very uncomfortable, challenging issue that I think we're going to need to explore. I'm not going to go through this. This is talked about in the report, but I think that the key issue here is how do we make decisions in this context? How do we build public confidence in decision-making systems in this context? So that's the first driver. Second driver, the decline of trust and deference. And so if we've got, and we see this, the Edelman Trust Barometer over the last number of years has shown a very concerning decline in trust across the Western world in key institutions, whether those are government institutions, think policymakers, think regulators, whether that's the media, whether it's industry, we're seeing decline in trust. But we're also seeing trust in flux. In essence, who or what people trust and with what levels of commitment is changing. Anybody who's been following Edelman will see every year they come out with seemingly something new. Trust is going in all of these different directions. Trust and confidence is very much in flux. And is this then a further blow to evidence-informed decision-making in an environment where people are less trusting and less deferent to decision makers, whether those are policymakers, regulators, communities, and the like? So how does one take evidence-informed decisions when both the substance and the process of decisions are in question, right? And we've seen this in the energy space, particularly around regulatory agencies, but also around broader decision makers, whether they're policymakers or others. The third driver, are we seeing long-standing verities under threat in the global economic order? And I just, as an illustration here, we chose Brexit. But when I think back, when I did my doctoral studies in the 1990s, the question of the day was, how is globalization and processes of economic integration, how are they affecting domestic policy formation? That's what I did my doctoral work on. Now, the question is actually, in some cases, the opposite. How are processes of sort of economic autarky, how are processes of protectionism, how are those affecting domestic policy formation, and how are they affecting international and intergovernmental policy formation? So we've got a very different environment within which decision-making is taking place. And again, I won't go through all of this here, but I think the question for Canada becomes, how can Canada position itself in this context? Because again, as we know, Canada, as Mike mentioned in his part of the presentation, we're a relatively small economy. We're a very open economy, open to international trade. And in an environment, if we have increasing protectionism, what does that mean for Canada going forward? How should Canada be positioning itself? Driver number 4, rapid technological change emerging in disruptive technologies. In the work that I do at the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, this is a huge component of our research and engagement and outreach agenda, and one that is often overlooked by decision makers who, for all kinds of legitimate reasons, are sort of focusing on the here and now and not necessarily thinking about what's coming down the pike. Just in case you weren't aware, what's in the box there, it's a positive energy report. It's on its way to you, to your home address. It's all good. AI, we've gotten it all taken care of for you. So the next one's going to come to you by drone. I mean, we laugh, but the question is, what does public confidence look like in artificial intelligence, in new information technologies, in machine learning, and the like? And many of these processes can be facilitative for energy, facilitative for reducing the energy consumption, the emissions intensity. I mean, I love the idea of my house being a smart home and maximizing the efficiency of the energy usage in the house. But at the same time, we also need to think about, what does public confidence look like in those systems? Think about the rollout of smart grids. Think about the rollout of smart meters, how that has been a fairly bumpy process in some jurisdictions, and that's just one relatively small, in the grand scheme of things, technologies. What is this going to look like writ large in the coming decades? The 5th driver, climate change impacts and adaptation, the increasingly visible and tangible effects of climate change itself. And we refer to this in the report as potentially the neglected side of the climate change coin. But increasingly, these issues are going to be felt in real ways and potentially have, and I think this is what we want to point to in the report, potentially have an impact on public confidence when there are tensions when it comes to resource allocation between climate change adaptation, where much climate change mitigation, where much of the focus has been to date, to climate change adaptation. There will be tremendous resource requirements going forward. What is that going to look like for Canada? So for us at Positive Energy, we see, and coming up with this sentence, it probably took us 8 months, but we're pretty pleased with it now. But for us, the key question for Canada is, how can Canada, an energy-intensive federal democracy with a large resource base, and we're not just referring to energy there, natural resources writ large, how can the country build and maintain public confidence? And our focus is public authorities. We're really focusing in on policymakers, regulators, and the like, making decisions about Canada's energy future in an age of climate change. We see a number of key areas for decision makers to focus on. Those are also the areas, conveniently, that we're focusing on at Positive Energy, and that we're really looking forward to your comments on today. So 3 critical work tracks, the first of which is polarization. How do we take decisions? How do we build public confidence in decision making? How do we navigate through polarized contexts? This is going to be a core challenge for the country going forward. Roles and responsibilities. And here what we're referring to is, how can we strengthen and better think about coordination of relationships between decision makers, in this case public authorities, in the energy and climate space. And those decision makers, again, it's important, I think, to point out, I've been mentioning policymakers and regulators, but it's Indigenous governments, it's municipal governments. It's a whole host of emerging, very influential and important decision makers where we haven't necessarily thought through exactly what the relationships are going to look like between them. Mike mentioned a moment ago the province of British Columbia and federal provincial dynamics in this space. We see that heating up, not cooling down over the next number of years, and the need for some focused research in that area. And then finally, consensus building. How do we build consensus around whether it's Canada's energy future in the broadest of senses, or whether it's a particular energy project in a more narrow sense? What are some of the models for building consensus, but also what are some of the limits to those models? We seem to, in some instances, our research has suggested that in some instances there is almost a sort of a blind faith that more consultation, more consensus building will actually lead to consensus. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So what are the appropriate models to utilize in which circumstances, and what are the limits to those models? So I'm going to take you very briefly through each of these, and then we're going to close up this this presentation. So when it comes to polarization, we need a better understanding of what the causes of polarization are, what its consequences are, but most importantly, this bottom piece here, how to address it. That's a really tough challenge, and one that I think we're going to be looking to you to help us with, whether it's to find some bright lights of initiatives that have worked in that when it comes to those challenges, or whether it's helping us think through how we should be framing up the research and engagement in those areas. Roles and responsibilities. So thinking through the relative relationship between policymakers, regulators, and the courts. We're increasingly seeing the courts playing extremely influential roles in energy decision-making. How do we nest or think through the relationship between Indigenous regulatory authorities and processes in our, sort of traditional, as it were, energy decision-making systems or existing energy decision-making systems, and what are the roles of municipalities going forward? And then finally, consensus building, as I mentioned, which models to use and when. How do we do a better job of identifying trade-offs and managing what those trade-offs might be when it comes to whether it's policies or individual projects? And then thinking through, where does community energy planning fit in? Increasingly, multiple municipalities and Indigenous communities are developing their own community energy plans. Where do those fit in terms of building consensus, perhaps for broader questions of energy? So, conclusion. There's a lot of P's in this report: polarization, parochialism, partisanship, public confidence. So we just summarize it here from 3 P's to 1 P. So there are some actions that decision makers can take immediately. And we recognize that some of these aren't necessarily easy to take, but we want to put them on the table. The first of which is framing energy and the framing of energy and climate debates matters. Mike talked about this when he talked about vocabulary. What vocabulary do we select when we're talking about these issues? Are the terms that we're using terms that lend themselves to constructive, productive debates, or do they actually amplify polarization? Getting past partisanship won't be easy, but having a more constructive discourse is a positive first step. Again, we recognize that that's going to be a challenge to undertake, and in our panel session, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what that might look like, how that might be able to be done. The third is to make climate policy as if energy mattered. That's a line that we've used at a couple of points in this report. And again, that's about thinking through, when it comes to climate change policy, thinking through the real worlds of energy in that environment, whether it's affordability, security, competitiveness, and ensuring that all of those imperatives are taken into consideration when it comes to climate policy making. And then, as I've mentioned, keeping some of these global trends and drivers top of mind. Finally, in terms of actions going forward, there's these 3 work tracks that we've talked about in the report that I won't go over again at this time, but that's what we're going to be focusing our research and engagement on over the next 3 years. So we undertake solution-focused research, and we engage on an ongoing basis, just as we are this morning, with decision makers and others in the field of energy and climate. We're looking forward to working with you on these issues. So thanks very much for your attention, and we're going to pass it now to Cameron to share with us the mind map. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Cameron.
A little like show and tell back in elementary school. So I read the report 5 times, and there were moments when I wish there was a. There were moments when I wish there was a Cole's Notes version, but. Yeah, there was a lot of information. So it was the idea of trying to synthesize and turn it into a visual language. So it's a bit lighthearted. In most of the cases, I did some drawing with pencil, some paint, felt marker, collage. Yeah, tried to cover as much as I could. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I'll let you just take a look at it. We're doing the break right after this. Okay, so here it is. So come up when you have a moment. It's a little lighthearted. We're going to have it on the screen, but I just finished it this morning. So some of the key elements, and I talked to Monica about some of it, but some of the targets that we have to meet. The skeptic hammering down on evidence-based decision making. Some of the key players in Canada and what they've been saying. Seems like every time, even on the prairies, when I turn the TV on, Mr. Ford is talking about no cap and trade. So it might be a bit hard to see from back there, but come up when you have a moment. When I do the live mind mapping, I'll do a drawing. I'm not going to record so much what's being said on the panel, but I'm going to record your thoughts when you tweet Raphael and I, or when you tweet to Raphael, and we'll explain that after the break. But we're going to ask you for one word to sum up what you think of all this business. Hey, that's sort of it, yes. So thank you. Enjoy your break, and we'll reconvene. Thank you.
So we finished a little bit early. What I'd like to suggest is we have our break, but we reconvene a little bit early. That'll give Raphael and Cameron an opportunity to share with you how they're going to do the mind mapping. So we'll see you in about 30 minutes or so. everybody. We'd like to move to the next portion of the morning. So if I could call the panelists up to the front. So as everyone is just getting settled in, we were so delighted and are so delighted to have an absolutely outstanding panel of energy leaders as a response panel for the report, to comment on the report, share their views of what they've read, and based on their own experience. So we have with us from your left to right, Tabitha Bull, who is Chief Operating Officer of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, David McLaughlin, Director of Climate Change Canada for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Laura Olafson, Director General of the Energy Policy Branch at Natural Resources Canada, and Joy Romero, who's Vice President, Technology and Innovation at Canadian Natural Resources Limited, and she's also Chair of the Clean Resource Innovation Network. Before we get started with our panel, and Mike is also joining the panel as well to provide some thoughts. Before we get started with the panel, I'm going to call up Raphael Desordi, who is our communications specialist. He's going to be sharing with you how you can contribute to help Cameron, who will be live mind mapping during this session. Raphael.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. As you can see here on the screen, I have tweeted this. Give us one word that summarizes your thoughts on Canada's energy future with climate change. You have our Twitter handle at uOttawa_energy. If you are not on Twitter, you can email me, Raphael.desordi@uottawa.ca. It's not an underline, it's a dot. I'm sorry about that. So you can either email me or you can reply to my tweet with one word, and we are going to do live mapping right there. Thank you.
Yeah, so the only text that I'm going to put on this mind map are the words that you tweet and email Raphael. So Monica said you can't have any more snacks. One word.
All right, so in case folks at the back didn't catch that, so Cameron's mind mapping will actually be drawing more on what you're saying than on what the panel is saying. So please do participate, whether you're watching the webcast or whether you're here in the room, by tweeting a reply to Raphael's tweet on the Positive Energy account, or you can email Raphael to raphael.desordi@uottawa.ca. Just one word answer to that question, and Cameron will use that to mind map. And for us, that will actually be really important at Positive Energy as well. Those single words that you tweet and send to us, we're going to be using those in our own reflections in terms of our research going forward. So please don't hesitate. We'd be delighted to hear your thoughts. So we have a great panel this morning. Each of the panelists are going to give you some brief opening remarks, and then we will move into a moderated discussion, and there will be time for Q&A at the end of that. You've all been very patient as an audience, and we know we've got lots of expertise here in the room, so we're looking forward to your thoughts as well. Each of the panelists will give some opening remarks. We're just going left to right in alphabetical order. So Tabitha, that puts you first.
Okay, good morning. Ani Bonjour, Tabitha Indigenaka, Snipasing Indigenaba. Good morning, I'm Tabitha. As I'm sure you've all read the bio, so I'm a member of Nipissing First Nation. My background originally was in the Ontario electricity system, so most of my comments will be more centric to Ontario. I thank you very much for having me, and I did go through the report a couple of times. I'll touch a little bit more on all of these things, but I think a few things I want to keep in mind and to point out is the need for us to look at Indigenous communities not just as a government and as a regulatory body, but also as a potential partner in a number of energy projects. While communities, and while we are ensuring that from the outset we are doing all that we can to protect Mother Earth and protect our water, that doesn't mean that Indigenous communities are not interested in entering into business and partnerships. So in Ontario, as an example, over 50% of the First Nation communities are partnered on a renewable project in Ontario right now, and I'm sure many of you have heard about the uOttawa project, which is a project of 24 communities that have partnered to bring transmission grid electrification to the 17 remote communities who currently work on diesel. One thing we need to keep in mind always is that those partnerships are built on relationships, and those relationships take a lot more time than a relationship would take between two business counterparts, both from a need for capacity development and also from a need of building that trust. So that uOttawa project started in 2008. In December of 2018, they electrified the first community, so that community has now is no longer using diesel to power their community for the first time ever. So it is very successful, but it's successful because it's owned partially 50% by 24 communities, so owned by the communities that they're electrifying. And that, as I said, has taken some time, but the success is seen because of the relationships and the trust that they have there. So I'll leave my comments mostly at that, but I'm sure I have a couple other key points around those type of conversations. So thank you, Miigwech.
Great. Thank you, Tabitha. David.
Thank you, Monica. I very much like the report, and I like the drivers of the report. I mentioned it at the end in particular. I think they do capture correctly the kinds of dynamics that we are facing today in the country on the energy and climate file. Color me pessimistic. I am at this stage not that optimistic that we will find a way out. It used to be that you could presume that Canadians, being very common sense kind of creatures and having those kinds of values of that come from building this country on a series of compromises historically and even more lately, should be able to sort this out. We may yet, and in that sense I suppose I should be, that's the dangerous optimism I guess that somebody was referenced, but there is no, in my judgment, clear path forward on that now based on the kinds of dynamics that we have. We have an election coming up this fall. And for those who have been around elections for a long time, in different ways, there is a whiff of 1988 free trade happening potentially. I say potentially. The last 6 weeks have kind of muddied that up a bit. So I thought we were en route properly to a clarifying election on climate and carbon. And like free trade in 1988, hard fought, tough rhetoric, but the country decided and turned the page. And not with a majority or view, a plurality view, but we got onto it and it's proven to be successful more than not, and here we are. I was hopeful, and still retain that bit of hope, that we will have a similar experience this fall. Because I see nothing, frankly, in either the policy proposals or the rhetoric or the dynamics that are happening now that offer a path out on its own in terms of the folks who are working on this, who are engaged in it, and have supposedly climate interests at heart, energy interests at heart, the Federation's interests at heart. The polarization is such that we are getting into increasingly not virtuous circles, vicious circles of rhetoric and all the things that go with it. But the public still has to pronounce on this. And with all the kinds of disruption that we're having in our public discourse, in our policy discourse, in the institutions that are, for the most part, being found wanting, in my view, in terms of finding the way out, we still have that one trump card, which is the public and the voters. So this may be very Pollyannish, if that's a word, but we need something like that in order to cut through, to provide that, ideally, that kind of clarity. We used to create organizations such as the National Energy Board and these other kinds of agencies, and that as arm's length to take the politics out of stuff, big important decisions. That was the rationale for it. And that those institutions and the processes around them, they too have become politicized, fairly or not. So what do we have left? So my pessimistic take is I'm going to leave it up to the voters. And that is also my optimistic take. So I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Laura, so you're sort of in the midst of all of this. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. The history of Natural Resources Canada with the Positive Energy Program has been an important one, and I oversee the intergovernmental relationship between on energy at the public servant level for the Government of Canada, supporting energy ministers. The last mandate of Positive Energy really helped us build a work plan at the intergovernmental table where we focused on engaging and building relationships, communicating transparently, advancing science and innovation, and ensuring effective regulations. And so I'm very excited about the work that they're undertaking because I do think that it will continue to help to support the work and the discussions that are occurring at the energy intergovernmental tables. What I do know is that Canada really does truly have an energy advantage. We have plentiful resources, skilled workers, innovation and efficient technologies and infrastructure. It is a wealth that almost no other nation knows. And over the last 4 years, we have worked very hard to try to find the right mix between attracting investment, supporting competitiveness, and protecting communities and the environment. What I'd like to do for the next couple of minutes is just take you through the journey that we've been on with this current government. The roots of this journey goes back to the Winnipeg Consensus and their call for a Canadian energy strategy. Provinces and territories, you may remember, took up this call, led by Premier Redford, who was seeking to build the pipelines to get greater market access, and in partnership with provinces like BC that were pushing for stronger environmental stewardship. At the time, the federal government decided not to participate in those discussions. But with the change in government, that desire too did change. And as you saw, there was unprecedented FPT collaboration that resulted in the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And while the Pan-Canadian Framework laid significant steps towards Canada's climate change agenda, it did stir up some challenging questions for the energy sector. Like, what does our energy mix look like a generation from now? What is the future of the oil and gas sector? Does nuclear have a role in this future? And are we making the right investments, and how do we get the money into those areas? So these were the type of questions that the Minister of Natural Resources thought that he should take to the Canadian people, and that's where we launched Generation Energy, which was a national dialogue on the future of energy. 380,000 Canadians engaged with us either online or in person over 6 months, and we had about 700 people come to Winnipeg for a forum to sort of discuss the outcome of that dialogue. There were some key words that we heard resonate that really came out: affordable, reliable, and clean. That's what Canadians wanted. We also saw some key themes. The low carbon transition is real and underway, but Canadians are not sure about its pace and scope. Canadians can play a significant role in the global transition if we want. Canadians want to see collaboration between governments and other players. Indigenous people are an integral part of this future. A strong and sound regulatory system that is open and honest is important, and technology and innovation is at the heart of any transition that we're undertaking. As a follow-up to Generation Energy, the Minister of Natural Resources asked a group of eminent thought leaders with various backgrounds to take a look at what we heard, as well as what they knew, and see if they could come up with some advice. And what they, after much debate, incredible amount of debate over 6 months, not only in the room, but on the phone, online. And there were moments of incredible tension where some of the members truly did almost walk out of the room. They did come to a consensus. And that's in the Generation Energy Report, which you can see on our website. They decided that it's an all-of-the-above approach for Canada. So first, let's waste less energy. Let's do everything we can to waste less energy. Let's switch to cleaner power. I mean, we're already 80%. Let's move that up as far as we can and increase the amount of electrification across the economy. Let's use more renewable fuels. We have a wealth there, and Canada could be a leader, and it is probably an underexplored area. And let's produce cleaner oil and gas. So we've taken this frame to the G7, to the IEA, and other tables, and we really do hear a strong level of comfort around that type of frame. We have taken it to the FPT table, and again, they don't sort of have a general problem with the frame, but as you know, we are now in a different FPT environment. And last year, in an unprecedented way, 2 ministers did leave the Energy Minister and Mines and Ministers table and didn't sign on to the communique. So it's been a journey, and the journey's not over, but what have I learned, or what have we learned so far that I think is relevant to the work that Monica and her team are going to be doing? So while there are certainly energy issues that are divisive, I think that the reality is that Canadians generally agree. And I think that there's some recent polling that shows that there is definitely a polarization of about 10 to 15% on either side, but the majority of Canadians are in the middle. They, see the relevance of pipelines to our economy, but also want us to be taking environmental and climate change action. What that means, or why it's showing up from a partisan politics perspective, is something I'll have to leave for others to consider and discuss. But I think the other thing that I've learned is that for trust to occur, there needs to be areas of mutual interest. And so some of the things that we've started to do is taking advantage of regional strengths and weaving them together. So for example, the recent announcement on March 1st by the 4 Atlantic premiers and federal ministers about a clean power roadmap for Atlantic Canada. We could find a lot of agreement with those provinces. The other thing is looking to work with partners like municipalities, and so $1 billion was recently in the budget to the FCM for energy efficiency, because really energy efficiency is delivered at the local level. Then the other thing is that framing does matter, and one of the things that is drives me crazy when we're talking about climate change and energy is so often we're talking about climate change or energy, and it's people aren't making the bridge between the two. This is not, and language does matter. Is it a transition? Is it a transformation? I'll certainly say that a 1.5 degree scenario is disruptive, and significantly so, and the means by which we're going to find the capital to fund that is going to take concerted thought and effort to move financial markets. In that context, I also think that we need a significantly stronger energy information system. I think that as a federal government, we're taking some steps, and I am working with my provincial territorial colleagues to start to try to figure out how we can make that broader. Because if we don't have a good basis of information, it really is hard to have the discussion. And so with that, that's sort of where I'll leave it and pass it on.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. Joy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Joy Romero. I'm Vice President, Technology Innovation at Canadian Natural Resources Limited. We tend to be a rather quiet company, though we are the largest oil and gas producer in the country. So not necessarily as well known as many of the other companies. I also have the privilege of playing in the collaborative space in oil and gas. And oil and gas has a very long history of actually working together. 30 years plus of the organizations that come forward to build up to where we are now. And the Clean Resource Innovation Network is actually established to be a network over all of those, as well as all of the institutions, great institutions across our country that are doing research in oil and gas to help us reduce our footprint, as well as help direct funding from various financial institutions and the entrepreneurs across our country as well. I did ask for a couple of slides to come up. One from the work from the report. And I think that what is really important that's on here is no matter what scenario that you look at, to 1.5 degrees or other, oil and gas is a part of that mix. And it's a significant part of the mix. And as you know, I really appreciate the report and the context that is in there. Probably the only thing I don't agree with in there is that we are technology takers. As Canadians and the oil and gas industry, we are actually a highly innovative community. We actually wouldn't exist without being that. And so we have a lot of technology that comes from within, but we also have a lot of Canadian technology that we work with Canadian entrepreneurs that we actually commercialize inside of our sector, and then that technology goes to other sectors, because water is water, regardless of the sector that you're in. Combusting natural gas is combusting natural gas, whether it's for this building or any other building or any other sector. And reducing land footprint is that in any sector. So the things that we commercialize that Canadians care a lot about is stuff that can be transferred to a lot of different places. When the other really important message about this is, as you look at all of those sectors, there are very few countries around the world that actually have all of these as a resource. That is amazing. And when we as a country don't work all of these together and actually polarize the development of all of these technologies as you go along for the use of Canadians and the globe, because remember, the other thing that we are notorious at as Canadians is being sustainable developers in our natural resources, and then those standards being technologies and standards being adopted around the globe, which is extremely important. And so if you take that leadership and this polarization, if we can make that go away and actually have all of these resources working hand in hand for that energy mix for Canada, how powerful is that? Nobody else is doing that. And that is typically Canadian. Because whether or not we are trying to drive a microgrid inside of a remote oil or gas field so that we don't actually have to bring in electricity and cut lines into that field, run it off of thermal and solar, that microgrid is the exact same microgrid technology that you want to run microgrids off here. So if we could only lose this distinction of one against another, and we actually bring together, how much more powerful are we as a country? And then how much more does that benefit others? So it is, and I can tell you that as an oil and gas industry today, the things I'm going to show you the next slide and talk about it, it is that integration across the full energy spectrum. We're in, as engineers, we really don't care where, an electron comes from or a gigajoule of energy. We look at that full energy system as to how you can sustainably produce whatever you're doing at the lowest footprint, at the lowest cost. And believe me, that lowest spend of energy is the lowest cost, So they are very much integrated and tied to each other. Next slide, please. The blue slide is where most people from a conversation think that where we are, and that's, I know you can't read that, but that's the intensity of oil sands, an average barrel of oil from that period of time. These are, the green ones here are where, for us as a company, we sit just above the U.S. refined average today. So that is, and that's not being technology takers, that is developing technologies as ourselves as industry and employing Canadian and sometimes from other parts of the globe as well, technologies that actually make a difference. And the dollar value that goes in there annually is $1.4 billion as an industry into the technologies that help us reduce that. Depending on the company that you are and the property that you sit, many companies are already below that line for what they are producing and or sit just above that, just as we do. We are not unique. These technologies that you see are just where we're headed over the next few years with technologies that we have in pilot or are building now. They aren't something that we're looking 20 years from now to implement. These are technologies that are in late pilot stage with actual, development will be operational by 2022, that kind of thing. That kind of near future that drop us as a company below this. If you take conventional oil and gas in our country, Jill Bergensen from U of C, one of the authors of the Know Your Oil, or of the models behind the Know Your Oil report, that was the basis of basically everybody's vision that was brought to Paris. In the models that based that as to where we sit as a Canadian industry, has said if the globe produced conventional oil and gas as Canada does, immediately that would be a 23% reduction in oil and gas as to how we produce oil and gas and our conventional oil and gas in our country today. So what I hope you are hearing is the message is that when Canadians don't use Canadian oil and gas as produced today, you're actually contributing to a larger global greenhouse gas footprint. That is where we sit today. What I want to tell you and what I want you to know is that our company, our goal is net zero greenhouse gas emissions. We're not unique. And what people don't understand is when you have facilities that have long life, like oil sands facilities, adding carbon capture, and by the way, our company has 4 carbon capture and something facilities. 1 carbon capture and storage, 1 carbon capture and sequestration, 2 carbon capture and enhanced oil facilities. We are the largest in Canada and 3rd in the world for carbon capture. The work that is going on now in Calgary, there's a carbon capture and conversion test facility, the only one in the globe, to commercialization level that is housing the X Prize finalists that will bring 5 technologies as a solution suite to us. There's another 5 in the US on coal. They also apply to natural gas. There were 110 applicants to that, or 112, applicants to that, 25 finalists, or semi-finalists. Some of those semi-finalists actually dropped out of the X Prize because they're already commercialized, which is really incredible. And some of them actually from this area, others from Nova Scotia. And so and when you have a long life facility, it makes sense to be able to put these kinds of carbon capture and conversion facilities there, because they also make money, and they give us other products. So are we on board as an industry to transition to lower carbon emissions as a country? Like you wouldn't believe. And that's a message that needs to be understood. Because when you go back to that other slide and you look at oil and gas, and you look at that being used globally, not only should the oil and gas for Canada be seen as a preferential supply to the world because we care and we're doing these things and it's real and that's our footprint, but also the technologies that we are developing here are transferable globally. And those are Canadian entrepreneurs. And so we also can grow the Canadian economy associated with the entrepreneurs that are bringing these technologies to us. And these things are extremely important, and they are absolutely cross-sectoral. The other thing, it's not just about the production side, because we generate our footprint using our own product. So when we develop carbon capture and conversion, or processes that reduce, help with smart grids, for example, or microgrids, all of that is transferable to other sectors. So Fortis, for example, has carbon capture and conversion on boilers in hotels and large buildings in Vancouver, in Calgary, in Edmonton. They're converting that to baking soda and creating soap that is used in the laundries in those hotels today, and have been doing that for a while. Natural Gas Innovation Fund is dealing with upstream producers with us. We've come together as upstream natural gas producers, as well as the utilities that bring these things through to end use. So I want you to see, just as people democratize telephones and then to our smartphones and made these everyday tools. When I went to university, it was rooms as big as, this floor that held the computers that we go to at 2 a.m. so that you could run something to get. And now we carry something, that's as big, many, many, many more times powerful. Our industry is democratizing these technologies, not just for our industry, but for that trans-sectorial, cross-sectorial adaptation as well. Why? Because it makes sense for us. And it is part of the things that lower our carbon emissions and lower our costs and make us more competitive globally. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joy. So I have a few questions I want to ask the panel, and then we'll move into a Q&A with the audience. We've got a microphone set up here, so we're curious to hear your thoughts. I'm sure the panelists have lots of things they'd like to continue to share. So I want to start with polarization, since it was something that all of you, in one way or another, raised in your comments. And this is something that for us at Positive Energy is really our job number one, is to begin understanding to what extent are we experiencing greater levels of polarization? If so, on what issues, who or what is being polarized? So I want to just start with a basic question to the panel. In your view, does Canada seem to be experiencing greater levels of polarization around energy and climate issues? And if so, why would you say that is the case? And then I want to start turning to solution space as well. But let's sort of start with a bit of a diagnosis of the problem. Does anybody want to jump in on that with some beginning thoughts? And Mike, you're allowed to jump in too. I think you got a mic there somewhere. Mike has a mic. Be careful if Mike has a mic.
I can start if you want.
Sure, go ahead, Lauren.
I guess the two things that come to mind when I think about polarization. One is, as I mentioned, I'm not sure that we are more polarized, but I think that polarized view in a 21st century social media environment have the ability to find the voice that they can relate to more, and that the message can be amplified is the first thing. And then the second thing is, I don't know if it's a polarization, but I've questioned whether or not the social contract that we used to have with Canadians and communities is actually transforming itself or changing. So you used to go into a community and say, we'll build a mine, it will have some environmental impact, but it will create jobs and economic spin-offs, and this was the social contract you had with the community. And my question is whether or not that social contract, one, still stands or even can still be made in a time of automation and artificial intelligence, whether or not, communities are still willing to make have those types of discussions and trade-offs. So those are the two thoughts or challenges I see around polarization.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. David, I'm really curious to hear from you on this, just given your experience in politics in Canada, long-standing in a variety of different governments. What's your sense?
In the 1992 Charlottetown referendum, I was in the Prime Minister's office working for Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and I traveled the country with him as one of my jobs in everywhere outside Quebec. So I went across the country in that very polarizing debate. And at the end of the referendum process, and the referendum was defeated, of course, those of us working in the Prime Minister's office were quite invested in it, and felt quite chagrined and depressed by the result. Might be akin to what's happening in that place now these days too, for different reasons. But we decided to have a party. Said, well, best thing to do is have a little bit of beer or something, wine and whatever. So we had little pins done up that said the elites want in. And we pinned it on each other because that was the response. This was the folks, it was an anti-elite backlash, a backlash against executive federalism as it had been practiced, 10 men in suits and the rest of it. So what we are experiencing now in some respects is not new. It's manifesting itself differently, but that decline of trust and deference in institutions chronicled so well by Peter C. Newman has taken root in many, many ways now in the country. So we are more polarized, and in part, and I concur that Canadians in their daily lives are not that polarized, and we don't worry about this stuff as we go around, except for those folks in this room who need to get a life, I guess. But on the extremes, may not worry about it, and those in the middle may not worry about it in their daily lives. Those in the extremes do. But the institutions have either become polarized or polarizing. And so where we used to have these safety valves to move things along, in a recognition that our traditional political debate had limits, and traditional political decision makings, would be insufficient in a more open and democratic world. The end of executive federalism, where premiers, first ministers would gather together and decide on that. The need for a referendum, and these things are all, antecedents to where we are today. But this decline in trust in the institutions and the people that manage those institutions means that when you are faced with this very tough set of problems that involves what? Trade-offs. By definition, we don't have the mechanisms, the institutions, and even if we did, and that, and yes, we do, and certainly we have, elected governments, we have parliament, and we have these quangos out there, quasi, judicial or whatever, regulatory agencies and that. But it's insufficient for people to accept the results when they are coming at it as decision makers, political parties, through such a polarized lens. And so the marketplace of that happened, we're working in different sort of ideas marketplaces, political marketplaces. So political parties are more polarized within. There's a reason why when you go to your base first to mobilize votes. So with voting preferences become more polarized, and as voting participation declines, it's better. Well, what's the way to win? Is get out more of your guys, more of your votes. And how do you appeal to them? You don't appeal to their better angels of their nature. You go to something else. You go to something that motivates them, that mobilizes them, that gets them worked up. And how do you do that? Generally speaking, through a more strident set of messaging. And the idea that this doesn't have knock-on or cascade effects in either the public discourse is, of course, nonsense. It does. But also has knock-on effects within those parties who then, I don't know if they're fully realizing, appreciating that their margin to maneuver is narrowing. And so we used to have political parties as these broad tent vehicles to bring folks together, enough sort of opinion that you could sort of work it through to get some things done. Now, when you appeal to more narrowly mobilized sets of voters who bring you money because you don't have these other public institutions that are giving you money, you have to get the money from the $5 from that person out there who's a member of your party, you pay attention. And so I go back to my pessimism. I start, that we don't have those kinds of our current institutions are failing on that front, and I'm not certain that there is a new institution. I mean, I look to that. Is there something? Could we create something new? Could we, find some other way to bring this stuff together? And I worry that it too would be inadequate, insufficient, and ultimately, fail. So, partial answer.
An excellent set of reflections. It didn't sound Pollyanna at all, just for the record, David. I want to come back to institutions in a bit, and I know Mike wants in, but I'd like to give an opportunity for both Tabitha and Joy if they want on this before you weigh in, Mike. Tabitha?
I think on polarization, for sure, that's definitely what we saw in Ontario. And a lot of that is you have, even in the research that you've said has been, people want to see renewable energy and clean energy, but nobody wants to pay for it. So if you have, voters who at one point are voting for clean renewable energy, the next time we come to an election, when the results of that have seen high electricity prices, then you polarize the voters by going with reducing electricity costs. I mean, the outcome of that has been that investors, communities are then polarized themselves in understanding whether they should take a risk of investing in these projects themselves. So I think we've definitely seen that in Ontario. I am I try to be an optimist, a bit pessimistic as well until electricity stops to be this electricity price that we're voting against. I don't know how we're going to build some consensus as a country moving forward.
It certainly points to the costs, and I mean we've really seen that in a number of recent elections in Ontario. Would be an excellent illustration of that, and the swings in policy then that go along with that, policy reversals and the impacts that has, whether it's on communities, the investment climate, even on voters. Do we have a carbon tax today or do we not? Really challenging issues in terms of developing policy that's durable and stands the test of time for the long term. Joy, thoughts on this?
Well, so remember, I'm the nerdy engineer in the group, as is Tabitha, and she's broken out much more than I have. And so the whole communication side of things, always to me, why I actually really enjoy being involved in this is because it obviously broadens my ability to understand, because lots of times I'm somewhat baffled personally how we are where we are. And personally, I was born in Montreal. My family's from Cape Breton. My father worked mining construction. I've lived in every province and remote community in this country almost, and done that in my career as well. Labrador, BC, Alberta. I live in the city now, which is really unusual for me. I normally live in communities that are 3,000, 5,000. Fort McMurray was huge, lovely city. And so I understand my background is the natural resource industry in Canada, and I have seen my children, my brother, sister, are still many a part of this, and I see the benefits of the natural resource industry in that spectrum and what it brings to communities. And the thing that's just so important to me in the polarization component is people, if they would just step back and look at what is globally good for our world, for our globe. I'm a grandmother, I have 7 grandchildren. I want what's best for them. I want them to be in a secure world, and I want their children to be the same thing. And people, this immediacy of I win this or I win this argument, it needs to go away. We need to have something that's much longer and much more enduring. And the non-adherence to truth in these conversations baffles me. How can you not be accountable that what you say is true? And Canadians, we're smart. And so why are we not filtering out stuff that isn't true? And so I still sit more on the baffled side of things. I'm not an expert in any of this kind of stuff. So I'm probably the confused whatever. And I obviously am here to learn and to understand how we help people see the bigger picture, understand the truth, and come to pathways that are truly good for Canadians and the globe.
And I think, I appreciate the candor, Joy, and I think that's what we'd like to at least try to do. As Mike said earlier, we certainly don't claim to have any particular perspective on this or expertise on this. There's lots of expertise in this room and beyond, but we are trying to shed light on some of these issues to better understand not only what is the nature of the challenges we're facing, but perhaps more importantly, what might we do to try to address them or navigate through them. Mike, you wanted in.
Yeah.
I think you just go ahead.
Just go ahead.
Yeah.
I want to start, maybe pick up on David on your point towards the end of your comments about, do we have the institutions that can cope with this increasingly polarized world? And certainly from the perspective of the political institutions, the answer, I think, is pretty clearly no right now. The incentive structure that politicians have to live with, and 99% of them are very reasonable people who want to do the right thing, but the incentive structure within which they work is really perverse right now. That's the pessimistic side of it. The optimistic side of it, I think, is that if you look at the issue at a different level, among what I'll call the active energy and climate community, and that includes people coming at it from a specifically climate and environmental perspective, and it includes people who come at it from a more specifically energy perspective, there is a remarkable degree of consensus in that community as to what it is we need to do. The problem is, how does that consensus get converted into something more like institution or institutions that can help to create more of the political space that will give the political actors more room to maneuver, because they do not have that right now, and the incentives drive them the other way.
David.
I mean, part of the dilemma is it's a political economy issue, and so where the resource and energy and climate problem, if you will, I mean, it is all of us, all Canadians, if you will, but in terms of Canadian emissions, the principal source of emissions that are trumping the ability to achieve goals that governments set and then fail on and that lie within Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular, because that's where the energy resources are. And so we have a political economy issue where, in fact, we're entering a situation where you make progress other parts of the country. You don't make it the same way there just because the quantum is so big. The problem is so big, and you have political parties. We have regionalized political parties, and so the Conservative Party, its political base is Western Canada, and so it feels and looks at that problem differently than other political parties. And it's good to have choice, absolutely in a democracy, but we have to be mindful that they are in many respects coming at it in different ways because of where they sit and what's sort of driving it. So it's we have to acknowledge that, because there's no way that the country can the country can survive, sure, in the country, but there'll be strains within it if we put all of the onus on one part of the country to fix everything, on something that we say, here's a national problem, climate change, and guess what, Alberta, you have to do 3 times as much as anybody else, or not, none of this will matter. Well, you are going to get strains in the Federation with that. You are going to get pushback from it, and you are going to get from folks who are just living and working, who are worried about their future and see this stuff differently. We talk about transition, and we throw up the word. You talked about vocabularies matter. I'm not convinced that a oil sands worker in Fort McMurray, hears the same thing when I say transition versus, there. I mean, they're concerned about security. These are good jobs. They're using it to put their kids through school. They're doing all sorts of things. Like, we have to acknowledge that part of it as well, and kind of work in order to get through this polarization. But we have a political economy problem in this country that has been exacerbated, in my judgment, and I'll finish with that, by governments who have put climate targets up in the window without a lot of forethought, who have not actually tried to put realistic plans in place to meet them, and have left the country in many respects to fend for itself, to sort it through. And you're going to have this problem. These are the residuals, and I think they, in many ways, they were preordained.
Joy wants in on the Alberta Saskatchewan thing, but just quickly before, so what's a better, I'm going to put you on the spot, David, what's a better way to frame it then? If that framing of that you mentioned, that is being used in some quarters because of the political economy of the country, what's a better way to frame it?
I'm going to answer that question after Joy goes, because I want time to think about it first.
All right.
Then I'll come back.
Okay, Joy, you're on.
So I think that when we look at Alberta and Saskatchewan being energy centers of the country, that's actually mistaken. I mean, there's a reason why the LNG facilities are being built in BC. Our largest natural gas reserves are in British Columbia. And so, and we have conventional oil being produced there as well. So, BC is a producer, Alberta is a producer, Saskatchewan is a producer, Manitoba is a producer, and then you've got Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, with just huge capacity there. By the way, some of the cleanest, lowest footprint offshore production in the world, coming from there as well. Obviously, huge natural gas reserves in Nova Scotia as well as in New Brunswick. There's Quebec is a producer as well, and then you have the petrochemicals industries, which of course are centered in Ontario and Quebec. So our entire country is an oil and gas producer, and subsequent products across the entire component. And the other thing is also just, even in a conversation here, when transition is implied to be off oil, and I think that's probably the biggest thing inside of Canada, that in that language, and especially if you use and this is where language matters, if you use the language as low carbon economy versus low carbon emissions, somewhere in that transition, it was renewable versus non-renewable fuels, and shouldn't be versus, should be we need renewables, one is non-renewable. Then also that we went to off oil from reducing carbon emissions. And just even here in the conversation of my colleagues on the panel, the realization that both lowering and reduction of emissions is also, to a net zero, possible with fossil fuels as a part of that mix. We're not having that conversation as Canadians. It's just assumed that fossil fuels are not a part of that future mix, which is not real as to what's either going to happen here in our country, nor the globe, nor for our contribution to the globe. So so when we say everybody agrees as to what it is, if it's that there's no fossil fuels, no, we don't agree, right? And so, but that's not where the conversation is. And so I think it's very misleading when politicians use those that type of language to the general population. Fossil fuels are a part of the mix, and we have a duty to make sure that they have the lowest footprint.
So before I give it to David to give us his answer, I just want to give a heads up to the audience. After that, we're going to leave it to you to begin asking questions. There's a microphone set up there if folks want to get set. And I wanted to just quickly add in that
Monica, can I just want to
Sure.
I'm not suggesting that everyone agrees on the specific solutions. Far from it. What I think the majority of the knowledgeable energy, and I mean that very broadly, community do agree on, is that we have been mucking it up for 30 years, and then we need to step back and be thinking about it in very, very different terms. And I think you would probably find that people in this room and the rest of that community would agree on that. But no, we don't agree on this.
And the other thing I was going to add, as Mike mentioned, some of our research is already underway. One of the projects, which Mike is co-lead on with Dr. Marissa Beck, our research director, actually looks at the term transition. And we're undertaking a study to understand how do different actors understand that term? How do they define it? Is that part of our challenge, to your point, Joy, that when people use that word, they actually mean different things?
So the other point, or other thing I'd like to share is when we talk about an oil sands worker being in Fort McMurray, when I was at my family reunion in Cape Breton, there were 4 oil sands workers at my family reunion that live in Nova Scotia, in Cape Breton, in that area. And they go back and forth to work. And when I was in New Brunswick to a conference and flying back and I was doing flights, more than 3/4 of that plane, given where I was headed, was actually oil sands workers. And I asked them, like, where are you going? I mean, they had the jackets on from the various companies and whatnot. Do that in every single province across this country, and those people go back and pay taxes where they come from. And I think we need to understand, and same thing if I'm going to BC. And so those oil sands workers live and pay taxes in this entire country.
Great. David.
So I'll be heretical. Do less. Our government after government, politician after politician has deluded us and everybody in this room and Canadians to say, we can achieve climate targets that we have now put upon you. We have accepted this internationally and we say, here it is. And in every case that I know of, none of them has actually done the underlying work to assess what that means in terms of bringing Canadians along with an actual plan to achieve stuff. So, you reap what you sow, as that saying. Who wants to be part of a never-ending cycle of failure? How do would you like to get up in the morning and go to work only to fail? Would you like to live your life like that, only to fail and be told that you're failing? If you're going to, there is a human behavior element of all this. We've talked about confirmation biases, all the kinds of things that you were mentioning, Monica. We look for perfect solutions that have every, as John Crosby would say out of Newfoundland, every jot and tittle sorted out. I'm from the Maritime, so talk like that now, bye. So it's just not true. We have to put things in place that are realistic, and then we have to achieve them, and then we have to stretch and do more by giving ourselves confidence that we can do it. And we haven't been doing that. And so you have governments and who then say, no, we're going to turn the page on this stuff. And we have policy lurch as a result of it. We have industries who then say, no, can't do that because you have it's just too much. I agree. You can't ever go to an oil and gas industry meeting and say, let's all stand up, put our hands up. We are all agreeing that we're going to get off oil and gas. It's not going to happen. Even realistically, it's not going to happen. But you're not going to actually move people along. So I'm of the view that we should be setting climate emission goals that are realistic. I would see them ground up, and if I did say there should be a need for a new institution, it would be there. That we establish a group of independent experts who can look at this arm's length established by Parliament with a statute and a legal basis to review what we need to do in this and set targets, goals, however, for Canada to move on this, taking into effect all these factors, something that would be durable and last between parliaments and therefore between governments. I would say the same thing for equalization formulas and fiscal transfers. I think there are certain things that could be done like that. Parliament would still be supreme and would decide on that, but they would be informed by independent expert advice that was ongoing, supported, and that was free of those kinds of dynamics. And I bet you if we did that, we would not have these 2030 goals that we have now. And I'd be okay with that. I have colleagues who wouldn't be, because Canada would then at least be moving along. What I'm worried about is that in terms of policy, by failing to set policy, we will be takers in all the other parts. What we are seeing now is disruption in the energy system. We're seeing disruption in the political system. We're seeing disruption in the climate system and the social systems that go with that. So if we don't decide to do this in our own way that works here, it's going to be done to us. Investors are going to make decisions on climate risk disclosure and other things, and the oil and gas sector will pay a price for that, and those other kinds of dynamics. So there is an institutional, modest solution, but to do that, boy, the polarization of somebody saying, wait a second, well, we have to do less. Well, I'd be ready to accept doing less because I think we would actually do more, and that would be the big shift that I see in this country. I don't have a job after this, I'm sure.
Thanks. David, so I'd like to throw it to you now, so for you to ask questions. We have somebody at the microphone. Maybe identify yourself before posing the question.
Hi, thanks, Monica. I'm John Stewart. I'm Policy Director at the Canadian Nuclear Association here in Ottawa. I hope this fits with what David just said, and I hope it will be encouraging to what Tabitha said about voters wanting clean energy or emissions reductions, but then not being prepared to pay for it. I think if you look at the low carbon pathway studies like the Trache Energy Futures project, you find that there are quite low carbon pathways available and low carbon policy choices available that are low cost, but governments have a tendency not to pick those low cost sort of high emission reduction options. They have a tendency to pick choices that are associated with a particular technology that they like to be photographed with, or that somehow deliver a sort of agenda that they're quite wedded to. So, Ontario a decade ago had a very low carbon electricity sector, and yet the government of the day went for this very showy, we're going to create a lot of jobs building solar panels and windmills, Green Energy Act, which was not well thought out, which was very expensive, which drove costs up, and there were a lot of less expensive ways available to them, such as refurbishing nuclear plants and getting rid of coal, which they did. Germany has had reasonably low-cost options available to it, such as hanging on to nuclear, which they are not doing. They're driving their costs up. So I think the question I'd like to offer is, why is it that governments don't select what I think David is suggesting, which is the sort of high return, low-hanging fruit for getting emissions down, and tend to pick these sort of showy, disruptive policy options instead? And how do we get to a situation where they do the former more and the latter less?
Great. Thanks, thanks, John. Who would like to jump in on that one?
I'll say two words: carbon tax. That's to me is a perfect example. If we accept the economics of carbon pricing, then a carbon tax should be the lowest cost, non-interventionist, non-choice instrument that governments should put in place. Except the problem is it's really showy. And no politician wants to get photographed with that. So you then look for other kinds of things, and that's another kind of trade-off. So I'm being a bit over the top, but to speak to your point, I think that's a live example that we have now.
Next question.
Bob Walker, retired government science executive. I'd also show my bias. I was a past CEO of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. I want to pick up on the polarization theme for going forward here for Monica and Mike, and suggest that while what we see and recognize as the challenge here is polarization in our political class, I want to tie it back to the comments that I heard on the panel around the the polarization we see in the basis of these parties. And what we have seen, I believe, is a polarization in the views as to what energy pathways we are on that's not necessarily rooted in fact. And to Joy's point, it's tended to translate into, on the parties on the right, it's a jobs agenda and an affordability agenda, and on the left, it's an anti-pipeline and let's get off oil and gas agenda. As opposed to coming back and saying what we should be promoting is an understanding on both bases that we can have an economy that migrates to low emissions with an all-in agenda. There doesn't have to be losers. And how is it we work that? And I would suggest that finding a way to depolarize the Canadian population actually will pull a depolarization of our political class along with it. Comments?
I just want to weigh in quickly on that before throwing it to the panel. I think it's a really interesting observation, Bob. And one of the things that we're looking at and we're just actually framing up the work on this right now, with a number of scholars who work in the area of polarization, is to try to get a better understanding of who or what is polarized. Because as was mentioned here, we've done a lot of public opinion polling work at Positive Energy that shows there's a broad middle of what you might think of as sort of moderate views. That are very supportive, yes, of reducing the carbon emissions of the Canadian economy, but also of developing and increasing development even of Canada's oil and gas sector, vast majority of Canadians. So then you sort of say, well, so wait a minute, where's the polarization coming from then? Is it a regional phenomenon? I think that has something to do with it, to David's points earlier. Is it that either end, sort of the either poll when it comes to the Canadian population, that there are perhaps greater voices there through social media, some of the points that Laura made earlier, really starting to deconstruct and better understand that, I think is absolutely job number one before getting too far down the line about do we need to depolarize the Canadian population. I'm not persuaded that Canadians, quote unquote, as a whole, are as polarized, frankly, as some of the elite. Let the elites in. Well, maybe we need the elites, let the elites out the door, show them the door. Maybe that's an area too where we're going to be looking at making a comparison between the general population, but also looking at the decision maker population. How much of this polarization that we're seeing is actually in the quote unquote chattering classes, less than what we're seeing in the general Canadian population as a whole. I don't have an answer for you at this point. We will have answers for you in the next number of months, but I think that for us is job one, prior to getting too far down the line about what actually needs to be depolarized. So I want to let folks jump in on that too. Mike?
Monica, I can't resist jumping in on this one. I mean, I agree with that, and I mean, we know this from a lot of evidence that the vast majority of Canadians, if asked what it is they're looking for from energy, is lower cost, somehow cleaner, but they don't really know what that means. It can mean a lot of different things, and then they assume that it will be safe, reliable, secure, and all of those other things because it just is. But the most important thing, I think, is that most Canadians, most of all, just don't want to think about energy. They just want it to happen. And they'll get the bill once a month and they'll pay it and they may grumble. But that's the end of it. They're not really all that interested in the majority of the debate. It is a different group of people who are driving this polarization. It's not your average Canadian.
I see heads nodding. We've got lots of questions, so I'm going to go back to questions. If you could just identify yourself before your question, please.
My name is Monica Kern. I'm from the National Research Council. And in one of the first slides Professor Gattinger showed was that technology is one of the 5 big drivers. And my question goes to all 4 panelists and is, from your vantage point, what is the most important science gap that needs to be filled as quickly as possible so that we can achieve a low carbon footprint? Thank you. In a reasonable time.
Okay, I'll start with our engineers. And I take your point, in a reasonable time. We have lots of questions. And Joy, and then Tabitha, and then we'll go to the middle.
Wow. I wish that there was one silver bullet that we could say that it was one area that you close the gap in. But what we've actually done as industry is what we learned actually through Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance is that when we actually declared as industry what our gaps are, we went from bringing 2% of the technologies that came to us to pilot to 30% of the technologies that come to us to pilot. And so what we've actually done through the Clean Resource Innovation Network is in the areas of low to zero hydrocarbons, digital oil and gas, land site reclamation, to land remediation, well site reclamation, clean fuels, water, is we've actually put out what our challenges are, and to try and actually have much more meaningful solutions focus. We can't tell institutions or somebody what to work on, but we can tell people what our needs are. And through that, hopefully, we will be able to make matches much quicker. And once that's done, is put the money behind where those solution gaps are. So from a footprint reduction, it's obviously the very first things, as Laura said, is the energy efficiency component of things. The very near things is often, they tend to be more engineering type problems and scale up, or how do I build this thing in the most cost effective way and get it running. The longer ones are, and many of those are step change technologies that we're trying to, commercialize today to, what we built 10 or 15 years ago. We will not build those facilities again. They don't fit today. But then it's that next step forward to much more to that net zero component as what does that take to make that every day. So there really isn't one answer. You need to go across that spectrum. And right now we're working with NRC. NRC has been a fabulous partner in trying to make sure that it's answering a lot of those 2 hard questions and setting that fundamental work in. Alberta Innovates is doing bitumen beyond combustion work. So, 2 places to remove emissions is pre-combustion or post-combustion. Post-combustion, it's some kind of conversion technology. Pre-combustion, there are many people that think, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, people will look at a barrel of oil and say, you combusted that one time? This is way too valuable. I mean, it's our roads, it's the materials that are around us, it's our clothing today, it's every single piece of thing that's around us. That's the petrochemical side and the way in which hydrocarbons are used. So it is extremely important that all of those questions move forward, because that's what gives you the selections as a Canadian economy and as a global solution. So it's not as simple as one thing.
Tabitha?
I think I would say it's education from 2 points of view. So from an Indigenous culture point of view, everything that we look at what's the impact on 7 generations from now. So what is the impact of what I'm doing on my 7th generation of child? And from a traditional knowledge point of view, I think we all have a lot to learn from the elders and from a perspective of traditional knowledge, both in development of projects, but also in innovation. So in a development of projects, we need to be looking at what traditionally has happened in this space before, what has happened with migratory patterns before, so that we can really understand what innovation is available in those project development. I think the other piece of education is education around the general population on current innovation that's already happening, on the actual amount of nuclear waste that a person would use in a year. So there, and the actual concerns around nuclear safety, to talk to John's comments about things that aren't flashy, and what is a nuclear doing about isotopes and pharmacy and medical. Those are things that, until we get general populace to understand where we have already come with innovation, similar on the population at the oil sands or reclamation in the oil sands, where have we actually come on that? I don't know that we're going to get general populace to buy into new innovation. And until we can get a real education on the general populace of where we've come, it's not going to be as easy to move forward on new innovative technologies.
Great, thank you. Laura and then David.
I feel like I will just defer to the engineers on this one. So, okay. David?
Very quickly, on the science gap, and then I'm going to go to the science technology gap. On the science gap, we need more precision on climate tipping points. We need to invest more to understand what is happening and when, so we can get at least some better idea of predictability, so we can drive the kinds of policy choices and decisions by governments and people around the world. And still in the zone of science. So let's take the science as settled and true, and we're on a pathway, 1.5 at a minimum. I suspect we'll blow by that, and 2, and probably blow by that as well. So we need to get technology on batteries. We need to get the technology and applications of carbon capture and storage, because if we're going to use oil and gas more, it's not just going to be the emissions intensity. We have to find ways to sequester that, and or with all those coal plants and as well. It's not just oil and gas, but coal plants in China and India. So we need CCS, and if that doesn't work, we better figure out geoengineering pretty quick. So those technology and science, batteries, and CCS would work both globally, but certainly in a Canadian context.
Great, thanks, David. So I'm conscious of time here. What I'd like to suggest is we take 2 questions and we'll have the panel respond to those. So please.
My name's Gerald Kootenay from Sixth Element. I'm a pundit on climate change politics. I was a little bit disappointed. I think the elephant in the room wasn't mentioned. And that elephant is the largest growth in greenhouse gas emissions in Canada for a number of years has been the oil sands processing. It's nice to say that carbon intensity has increased. That's a real small step. It's like the tobacco industry saying we've developed a low nicotine cigarette. And so it's critical for Canada to succeed in whatever we're going to do with greenhouse gases, that somehow to stop the huge growth in the processing of the oil sands. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, hi. First, my name is Peter McKinnon. I'm associated with engineering and business school here. I'm interested in disruptive technologies and disruptive business models as a sort of a background. My question is first before a question, thank you very much, panel, for an interesting debate. My question relates to something I haven't heard anything about yet, and that's about incentives, and specifically incentives, and I mean that in the broadest sense, to the oil and gas industry. Given that Canada actually exports more oil and gas than we consume, we're also sending out our greenhouse gas rich produce to other countries, and at the same time we're trying to reduce it here in Canada. My question then is there a possibility of using the incentives of various types from exploration to production and distribution to assist in transforming the industry to lower greenhouse gas production through a wedge effect, some kind of an economic wedge effect, and slowly moving them off at a reasonable rate off the current kinds of incentives to encourage them to do other sorts of investments in their stream. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Comments from the panel?
Sorry, so what was your name again? I'm sorry.
Gerald Kootenay.
Gerald. Kootenay's great last name. Lived in Kootenay's, bore 2 children there. I think what's really important, and what I had hoped would be heard, is that it's not just it's not just intensity that we're targeting as a reduction in the oil sands. It's actually to go to net zero, and that we are working on technologies to actually make that happen. So one of the technologies that we're piloting in later stages right now at CITE actually eliminates tailings ponds. It goes to a dry tailings right away. Up to 40% reduction in GHGs, and there can be some bolt-ons later that can actually bring that down to net zero. At our Horizon Oil Sands facility, we are capturing CO2 off of our hydrogen plant and sequestering that in the clays today, and looking at other technologies to do that. So it's not just an intensity reduction. And remember that we have a 100 megaton cap. So it's, if you have a cap, and we do intend to grow the resource, not just for Canadians, we have the privilege to exploit the resource on the behalf of Canadians. It's a Canadian resource. It's an Alberta and Canadian resource. And as we grow that, there is an oil sands cap that all of us as producers have agreed to. So that means that intensity, it's not just intensity that needs to come down, it's the absolute number also needs to grow. And when it comes to the motivation component, remember that we exist in a global economy. And that, certainly those of us that are publicly traded companies don't answer just to the policies that are there, but we answer to the expectations of the people within the globe. So the environmental sustainability and governance components and stewardship of our earth and how we behave is also driven by our investors over and above the regulations that are there. The other thing I think that people really need to understand is we're Canadian, lots of us are Canadian companies. And it's just in our DNA of who we are is to do the right thing. It is our job to make sure that we provide energy for Canadians and for the globe. But we do that in the most sustainable way. And absolutely, it is our intention to do as you say. And I don't think it's an elephant in the room. There are others that are here in the audience from other producers. They're going to tell you the same thing that I am. That absolutely is our intent and our direction that we're going.
And I know we're running out of time for this quickly. It would be very nice in your presentation if you admitted what the absolute emissions are from the oil and gas industry, which they never do.
They're actually in the cap if you go on the websites. And yes, you're right. They could be there. But they are reported to every single Canadian every month. We are so blessed as Canadians to have we have the most transparent system of reporting that exists in the globe. That's actually why we can actually have these conversations and you be as knowledgeable as you are, is because every single emission that we have, regardless of where it is in the system, whether it be water, air, etc., and every component is reported publicly.
Comments from other panelists? Yes, Laura.
Okay. I guess the two things that I'd like to mention. One is on the oil sands processing. You're right that that is a clear area of focus. And when I think back to the discussions around the Generation Energy Council, they spent hours and hours. But they also they had discussions around the following. Could we be the cleanest gas producer in the world? And could we be one of the cleanest oil producers in the world? And in some cases we are. And you add that to, we're a democratic society with one of the best transparent reporting regimes in the world. And you start to see a competitive advantage of our product there. And then you start to think about, and what if we can displace with that cleanest oil and gas, coal in China or India and in some of those markets. And so we saw a potential opportunity that I think we're having discussions about now, about what could that future be. Maybe we use less in Canada, but is there still a market and a place where our oil and gas would be better than the alternative somewhere else in the global economy? And then the second thing on incentives, this is an area that I would say that we're really starting to try to dig into. So, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, we've obviously made the commitment around that and are working to reduce those. But the global movement around sustainable finance is significant, and some of the movement was actually very negative towards our oil and gas and extractive sectors. And so we've really had to start engaging in that dialogue to say, actually, there is a place for these fuels. They definitely need investment, but they need the investment to incent the right actions. And so I would say that it's not a place I've got the answer for you, but the place that I'm trying to come up with the answer, and would welcome any help in developing instruments that could work.
David?
Just the two questions are distinct but related in the sense of how they talk about the oil sands and the drivers for growth versus the drivers for less growth, perhaps. Put it that way. So I would echo what Laura said in answer to your question about the incentives. The fossil fuel subsidy dynamic is a real one. It's been recognized for many years by G20 countries. There's been communiques and declarations to eliminate what are called inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Canada has signed on to that, and we need to continue to make progress on that. There's going to be a report by the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development in April 2nd or 3rd or something that's going to review and assess Canada's subsidies in this. IISD has done some work on that. So, and this relates to the transparency piece. I mean, we first of all have to know what those subsidies are, and I do echo what colleagues are saying about the transparency of our system. I mean, we have that information, which is essential if we're going to make some policy choices. But the incentives have all been towards growth and expansion. What the other incentives should be, I'm not sure. There's a whole suite of different things. There's no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet. But I do echo as well what Laura said. I think the international financial marketplace is starting to make those choices for us. And we'll see. There's also an expert panel on sustainable finance that the Government of Canada has set up. Minister Morneau and Minister McKenna set up as a report, I guess, later this spring. And I would look for that as being a very solid piece, and I hope a roadmap to show how we can leverage new money into this low-carbon economy, but also address issues of climate risk disclosure and other things that investors will need to make these kinds of choices, and that legitimately, as Joy mentions, are a pressure that on for shareholders and the C-suite. In terms of the broader picture, your question, Jarl, about elephant in the room and the oil sands in terms of capping, of the growth potential, that cap that is there that Joy mentioned, I hope that cap is still there after April 16th. And I think it would be a very important gesture on the part of the sector, the industry, because I am expecting a change of government in Alberta on that date. So if that happens, I'm not voting there, so I may be wrong and all that, and I have nothing to say about it per se. But I would think it would be a very important gesture that those companies who have acceded to this cap as part of a negotiated climate plan stand up early on and say, even though there's going to be changes to a new government, democratically elected, say, okay, no to a carbon tax and other things, that we will still abide by that, or something equivalent to that. Then we'll see. And fairly, and so I'll put a little bit of public pressure on in that regard to see. But the reality is, you are correct, Gerald, in terms of our emission pathway. The emission path, we can get all emissions down across the country, and if we are still on the same path of what have been emissions growth from the oil sands sector, we don't meet our Paris targets, etc. And that's why, in part, I argued for a healthy dose of realism and perhaps an alternative approach, because I don't believe it's sustainable in a federation like Canada where we have compartmentalized powers and authorities, and then the exploitation of natural resources lies within provincial, that jurisdictional authority lies with provincial governments, and so they control the pace and scale. We don't have all of those kinds of leaders. We're not a unitary state. And I worry about the strains on the federation of imposing all of the action, if you will, on one part of the country. And it'll be perceived as such, even if Joy is correct in saying there's oil and gas workers across the country. I don't think it changes the essential political economy point I was making. I don't think that's sustainable for a country to just do that. And so we may have to rethink different kinds of incentives. We have to rethink the way we do federal transfers. If we think emissions are so important to get down, are people in Ontario willing to pay the richest province in Canada, with the highest fiscal capacity? Are they ready to have a higher fiscal transfer through the federal government, through federal taxes paid by everybody in this room and across the country, including in those provinces? That's sort of like like a reverse equalization, in order to provide the incentives and the sort of a no net loss of revenue or lifestyle or something like that. I'm not saying that's a solution per se. I'm just saying that you got to maybe think a bit differently about that. This is more than just where the source of emissions come from. It's the way we see ourselves as a country. Alberta is our China, if you will. I'm saying that, if we know in the world, if China doesn't get its emissions down, we have a lot of people saying, "What's the point? It's not going to matter." That kind of dynamic in Canada will be a very debilitating dynamic in terms of us being able to proceed on other things. And it doesn't have to be, but it's tough. And then we go back to where the political incentives are and whatever. So we may need to rethink or think differently, about this. So that elephant is there all the time. What I think we may be missing is some innovation about how to address it. And I don't have the solution by any means, but I am pondering and suggesting we do have to think about it. And I'm waiting for April 17th for the oil and gas sector to say, yeah, we will abide by that. I think that'd be a hell of a signal.
I don't think you need to wait. I don't think you need to wait. I mean, I showed you our path to greenhouse gas reduction. That's independent of who's in government. And with respect to absolute, that you talked about actually in our methane reduction, between 2012 and 2017, 2018 numbers aren't public yet, they will be shortly, we had a 71% reduction in absolute methane emissions. Absolute, not intensity, but absolute. And so I think there's just a really a misunderstanding of the commitment of, and I'd love to talk with you more, and that it actually is a sincere understanding of each other. And maybe, if I sat down and showed you the projects and showed you what we're doing and help you understand more what we are doing, it's not real. It is real, and it is absolutely committed to make these difference. And these are the paths that we're on, regardless of the company. So think about the reductions that I shared with you in the technologies. In our industry in oil sands, they have to have been on the books and in development because it takes 15 years to build something. Look at the last 15 years and the number of government changes that we went through. Those weren't driven by who was in government, by what we built and now commissioned and actually made those changes. Those were built because the engineers who were building those things cared and built the lowest cost, most sustainable technologies that we had in the day to build what we had. That's how those improvements that you see that we've made today made it. They spanned a lot of different governments, both federally and provincially. And the work that we're doing now will span a lot of different governments that come and go. We work with any government that is there in the time. That is our job. But it's also our job to build the most sustainable and most competitive operations that we can build.
So I see that the folks along the back window, is this a lineup? Okay. The lineup in the best sense of the term. Although I know some of you, so you know. Okay, so what I'd like to suggest is that we hear all of the questions. Very brief questions, please, 30 seconds tops, and we'll get a very brief answer from each of the folks on the panel, and then we'll close for the day. I want to be respectful of your time and have you out of here by noon. So, Jacob, you're up. Make it fast.
Thanks, everybody. Jacob Berg, the Energy Council of Canada. Just struck by the discussion today that in our own lifetimes, the big debate went from peak oil to carbon budgets. Almost overnight for all of us in our lifetime. And my experience was we just kind of figured out how to get the oil sands separated back around 1996 in time for the rest of the world to change the debate, where it was starting to be about carbon budgets. And since then, from what I've seen from Joy's slides and from all the discussion, everything I've heard, we have been incredibly responsive to that as a country. And I'm always one to say, Canada is a very young country, but a very old democracy. And we have a proven track record of actually responding to this stuff. And I keep wondering when do we get the chance to push back on all of the negativity that was put upon us? I don't disagree with some of the international campaigns and the like that were put upon us years ago when the debate was changing and we were just catching up to it as a country. But the thing that I'm finding a bit tiresome is that we've shown that we take this seriously, that we make significant improvement, and yet somehow we still suffer under a negative view from around the world. Like, when do we start fighting back is the question that I always like to ask at a forum like this.
When we're not the worst per capita emitter in the world.
Right.
When we're not number one, when you and I are not the first people on the head of the list of the worst performing country in the world. We are the worst. We're number 9 in absolute of 1. This debate is ridiculous.
But do we get nothing for our improvement that we've done? Do we get no recognition for it? Okay.
We made it worse.
All right, I'd like to suggest that you carry on. Past the, once we close things off formally, you can continue that conversation. Next question.
Mark Hammer with Canadians for Clean Prosperity. I'm struck by the panel saying that there is a pretty large consensus among the policy community, whether people coming from an environmental background or an energy background, as to what has to be done. And also there's about a 60 to 70% majority in the Canadian population that accepts there has to be both limits on greenhouse gases and probably some kind of a carbon price, but also development of oil and gas and acceptance of pipelines. So there's a consensus at the elite level, a consensus at the public level, but at the political and media level, all the incentives are to polarization. That we know that political parties are driven by fundraising and their membership base. Social media is driven by negative emotional images. So we've got an incentive structure creating this polarization, even though there's consensus at both the public level and the elite level. So is there, a traditional way that Canada has dealt with some of these contentious issues in the past has been giving them to a respected, bipartisan, nonpartisan Royal Commission, often reporting from one government to a government of a different stripe, whether it was Medicare, free trade. Would that kind of, is there some way of taking it out of the political debate in the short term to actually allow for that consensus that seems to be there to manifest itself?
Interesting point. Something I've actually called for in my writing. So, Mark, we're on the same page. Last question.
Peter Narbites, ICF Consulting, and this is mainly for Laura. So, you talked a little bit coming out of Generation Energy about, the trifecta of what people want in terms of reliable energy, affordable energy, and minimizing environmental impacts, which makes a lot of sense. And I think just the issue comes down to sometimes, not all those things come together, and certainly everyone expects reliable energy when you flip your light switch on, but there can be a tussle between affordability and the environmental impacts, and I think sometimes the pathways to get there aren't fully understood, and this has come up through a few of the panelists today, fully kind of understood the cost and implications of some of these different pathways. So I guess I'm wondering what sort of plan NRCan has to keep building on some of the work you have done in the past to help be a source of informed kind of cost and just potential information on these pathways for the discussion.
Great. Brief response from each member of the panel. Tabitha, we'll start with you, and then, well, maybe Laura can answer that one when it gets to her. because we're very close to noon now, so I'd like for us to try to close off. So any thoughts from you, Tabitha, final words?
I think final was not to answer the question on information, but I think I did want to provide one final comment on the report specifically, and on some of the language that we're using, and I think where we need to move forward a little bit is we keep calling these Canada's resources. And what decisions is Canada going to make about their resources? And I think some of that and some of the resources in Canada are still up for debate, whether those are Canada's resources. There are still areas that are not covered by treaty. There are still discussions under United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People that may call into question whether all the resources we're currently discussing about what we're going to do with are actually Canada's resources. So I think I would just ask that in the next 3 years of the research that we really give that and UNDRIP and what's going to happen with the bill around UNDRIP some serious consideration.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. David.
I second that. I'm glad you said that, Tabitha, because it's an important dimension that people appreciate. It's a complicating dimension, but it's a realistic dimension, and we have to come to grips with that. So I want to go to Mark's, try to answer Mark's question about institutions, and try to find whether it's a consensus institution, or I think you're more thinking probably a path forward institution. So we used to have traditionally, I say, royal commissions. I'd say the Generation Energy report and process was a way to, it wasn't institutional in the sense that people would say, okay, the wise men and women, that we should, listen to automatically. But it was a way to try to bridge some of that, and frankly, there's some useful stuff in it, but it's got to get taken up by people. So I want to maybe push that little idea that I put out there before. I think about an institution that should be created by Parliament to look at what realistically should be our ambition for climate and carbon budgets. Because I think we are, Jacob's point about that, the debate has shifted. I think we are into a conversation about limits, fairly or not. And so is it a carbon budget or what have you? There's finite amount of caps, carbon budgets. In Manitoba, where I'm doing work with the Manitoba government, we wrote up a climate and green plan that has carbon savings accounts, which will set up 5-year emission reduction goals. And then measured and independently assessed and the rest of it. So we are trying to push the envelope on the institutions, but I would argue for something like that would be established in Parliament, perhaps akin to the UK Climate Change Committee, and that would take as much as you can, realistically, of the analytical and factual piece. I mean, Joy talked about the need for facts and truth, and that. If you have this kind of institution that brings that together and says this is where Canada should go in terms of its emission reductions, of its carbon budgets or equivalents, and it's based on the best analysis, and it's all seen and transparent and supported, then you know that it'll be harder for political parties with the incentives that you talk about, which in a way kind of a reverse polarization. There's more consensus elsewhere, but then it gets polarized up at the top, the apex of the decision makers. So let's take that point and accept that. We need to create institutions that take that out, away from them, much in the same way akin to what we did when we created these regulatory agencies to take decision-making away on things like create the National Energy Board or whatever. So, there's much more, in substance to what I said, but I'm not, all the evidence is, I'm not seeing an alternative to top-down setting targets, missing targets, new government, all that stuff. We need some kind of institution or approach or process that can realistically look at that, balance these kinds of interests, and say this is where we're going and this is what we're going to achieve. These are the roles and responsibilities of relative, governments, and that is durable enough to fix that one thing that I always say in these talks is that the real problem is that the climate cycle and the electoral cycle do not match. And so we got to find ways to bridge that, and this is one.
Great. Thanks, David. Laura.
Quickly, so where there is consensus, I guess the one thing I would say is I'm not clear that there's consensus on pace and scope. So people generally agree in the broad direction, but pace and scope is something that I think, is where we start to have challenges. Where do we get to start showing off some of the progress we've made? I'll just make a shout out to the Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation, which we will be hosting in Vancouver in late May, which will be an opportunity for Canada to start demonstrating. I would argue we already have started demonstrating our leadership on the global stage, but certainly take it front and center and bring Canadians in on the international discussion. In terms of a Royal Commission, the joy of being a public servant is every 4 to 5 years we get to develop transition advice, and so I have enjoyed this discussion and have been writing down ideas of things that may show up in my transition advice. That said, I just sort of point out one thing that somebody recently said to me was, Laura, you guys really, at the federal government, you will never understand the provinces until you understand electricity prices. And so I think that that is, something when we're just thinking broader energy policy, electricity prices are important to the political discourse that occur, and that is, more in the provincial domain. And then in terms of what do we have next, reliable, clean, affordable, I agree the tensions around them are a challenge. It's why I think we spend a lot of money investing in innovation, and the innovation agenda has been so important for the government. Also the infrastructure bank to help finance some of these things. There's a carve out there particularly for electricity infrastructure. The federal government has pledged $2 million for an electricity roadmap for Atlantic Canada to work with the Atlantic provinces, so making the investment there in how we can get to that reliable, affordable, clean future. Off-diesel communities, making significant investments there. And then I really want to highlight the $1 billion investment to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities that is focused on energy efficiency, both in the residential and institutional sectors. I really think that that is a really significant step forward in helping Canadians be able to achieve that affordability and clean. So,
great. Joy, final quick word, not plural word.
Urgency. Urgency. And I hope what you have heard from me today is the urgency that we see as an industry to be carbon emissions competitive, to be cost competitive, and not something that and doing that in partnership with the communities in which we are operating. We have a long history of that, and something that obviously we're figuring new and better ways of doing that every day, just the same as the technology side of things.
Mike?
Responding in some measure to some of the questions, what I'll do is take it, Monica earlier on talked about the 4 Ps, the first 3 being the negative ones that we're fighting against, and the ultimately public confidence, maybe. Let me add 2 more Ps. Paris. Paris 2030 is essentially, first of all, we're not going to make it under any circumstances. And secondly, it doesn't matter. What it mainly is a cheap way for politicians, yet another P, to look green without actually doing anything. So forget about that, but let's talk about prices. Prices are doing something, and we need to think about that, including carbon pricing, and get that conversation back on track.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So Cameron has been working very hard here. I see the sweat on his brow.
Just 30 seconds. So here's the words that came in the images. Transformative, fear, urgency, future, politics, trouble, change, skeptical, dysfunctional, technology, power, uncertainty, promising, costs, balance, complex, climate, worried, change, energy, tax, divisive. So that's sort of what we came up with. And I just wanted to say that the whole purpose of this, to quote my fellow Winnipegger, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. There's just many ways to disseminate information. So whether it's to the arts or technology, so just keep that in mind. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Cameron. We will be making those available on our website. Feel free to continue to tweet one-word answers. I promise, Cameron, we won't make you make any more changes to it after now. The presentation from this morning will also be available on the Positive Energy website. I have a couple of thank yous to give. Before I do that, though, I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel for really an outstanding set of remarks. So while we've been here doing this session, there have actually been research projects that are continuing to be underway, that we're getting underway, and that are already underway at Positive Energy. So I wanted to just thank the Positive Energy research team. We're a pretty large team and growing. You saw a couple of us up here on the stage today, but there are many others. I wanted to begin with Dr. Marissa Beck, who is in the orange blazer, who keeps us on track and is one of our lead researchers. We have a number of researchers both in Canada and in the United States. Stephen Bird at Clarkson University, Bryson Robertson at Oregon State University, George Vey, who some of you know, who practices energy law out of Toronto. He's also affiliated with U of T. Our postdoctoral fellow, Patricia Larkin, who is not with us today, probably working on her project on CCS right now. And we have a number of graduate students, Rafael Aguirre, who is here in the back helping us with our work on polarization, a doctoral candidate. Sébastien Girard Lindsay, who can't be with us this morning, but is also working very closely with us on a number of research projects. And Amy Richard, is Amy still here or does she have to go to class? So Amy Richard is another one of our research assistants on the project. None of this for what we've done today, and frankly, more broadly, would be possible without the gentleman at the back of the room, Raphael Desordi, who is absolutely outstanding in the work that he does for Positive Energy. Thank you, Raphael. I was able to go off traveling and know I could come back and just show up this morning and it would all be extremely well organized. Thank you. Finally, I just want to give another shout out to our funders, without whom we absolutely could not do this work. So in alphabetical order, that's Alberta Energy, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the BC Oil and Gas Commission, BC Utilities Commission, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Wind Energy Association, Cenovus, and CANA, and NRCan, who we have participating on the panel today, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So a big round of applause to the funders for our work. And the final note to say is that our first conference that will be coming up to release initial findings around the work that we're doing on polarization is coming up mid-June, June 13th, June 14th. You'll start to see save the date information going out for that shortly, and we hope that you will be able to join us at that event. So thank you so much for being with us today, whether here in the room or on the webcast, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a good afternoon.